Hi everyone, my name's Kirstie and today we're going to learn how to draw a soundscape. You might not know what a soundscape is, but a soundscape is like a landscape, only it's about listening. So we're going to be thinking about listening to sounds and how we could draw them, and then we're going to get our wax crayons out, we're going to make some crazy shapes and we're going to rub them onto our paper so that we can create a big space drawing that feels like some sounds that we've heard. So first of all, we should probably check that you've got everything you need. What you're going to need for this is some paper. You can use paper of any size, but you're definitely going to need some paper. You're going to need some pens to draw with, or pencils. If you prefer drawing with pencils, that's fine. You might even like wax crayons. If you've got wax crayons, we're going to use those later, but you can use them for drawing too. You will also need afterwards, after we've done our drawing, we're going to do some rubbings. And to do that, you're going to need some bits of scrap. These are all things that I found in my recycling bin. So a bit of cardboard, that's like a cereal box, any of those sorts of things. You might need a bit of string perhaps. If you've got string and some glue and some scissors, then that will be everything you need. So if you need to run and go and get them, you can go and get them. Don't forget, you can always pause the video whenever you like and stop and get what you need. So let's start by looking at a really famous artist called J.M.W. Turner. And this painting is called Snowstorm, a steamboat off the harbour's mouth. You can see in this picture, it's got a sort of swirl in the middle of it. And right in the middle is a boat. And you can see that it's a steamboat because it's got a plume of smoke coming out of it. Now there's a story that Turner went out and asked a sailing boat to tie him to the mast of the ship so that he could go out in a giant storm and make some sketches and remember what it was like to be out in this howling storm out on the ocean. But now people think that he probably didn't really do that. And when you think about it, I think he probably didn't really do that either, because if you've ever been in a storm, even a snowstorm, or on a ship where there was a lot of splashy waves coming over the side, it would be really hard, A, to keep your eyes open, and then think about holding your paints and your pencils and trying to draw, and if paper was getting wet. So I think it's more likely that Turner came back, stood out on the seafront, because he lived down by the sea, stood out on the seafront, looked at those crashing waves, and then used his imagination to draw how it feels or how it sounds to be outside. So that's quite a good idea. We've got a lot of pokey shapes and swirly shapes, and also you can see the shapes getting bigger as they come out of the boat, get swirled away into the wind. So you might want to think about that. Let's look at another artist. Let's look at this artwork by Li Yufan. And this one's called From Line. This is quite different, isn't it? He was actually just thinking about how he could use his materials. He wasn't thinking about the sounds or how things felt. He was thinking about the materials that he was using. And so he's loaded up his brush and he's taken it and he's put it straight at the top, put as much paint as he could on his brush, and then stroked it down the page to see how long the paint would last. Now, even though he wasn't thinking about sound, to me, this looks like the sound of rain. You know, when rain falls hard, but by the time it hits the ground, it makes a sort of pattering noise. So it looks, if you look up at the sky, like it's coming down really fast. But once it hits the ground, actually, it's going on the bottom. So this painting, to me, looks like the sound of rain, which is an up and down sound. Let's look at another one. And this one's quite different. Again, so this one's by an artist called Avis Newman. It's called The Wing of the Wind of Madness. And I just love this picture. It's like a sort of blowy explosion. You can see loads of different sorts of marks, lots of different things happening. Some of that looks like maybe the shape of a bird. So you feel that like it might be flying. But also it looks like maybe some stuff has bashed into each other. There's loads of different types of mark which give you a really interesting feeling about it. So I feel like maybe Avis Newman was thinking about what it's like to be out in the wind, where you feel like you're being pushed in lots of different directions, or maybe sometimes when it's really windy you can see things being pushed around the streets or trees waving in the wind. So that has that feeling of sort of chaos that can come out of the wind. So I really like that one. So those are three really different ways of thinking about what sounds might look like when you put them onto paper. So now that we've got those ideas, let's listen to some different sounds and see what they look like when we put them onto the paper. We're going to listen to 3 different sounds and we're going to draw them onto our paper. I'm going to use pens. You can use whatever you like. Pause if you need to go and get anything, obviously. But the first sound is going to be the one that we've heard before. So let's listen just to a little piece of it and think about what shapes we might be looking out for. I think with that blowy sound, so we could hear, it's the sound of a snowstorm, and we could hear a sort of a windy sound, which I think makes a shape like this, that would go round, I think, or maybe one that would go up and down. And we could also hear something that was probably the snow falling, maybe a shape that had a curve on the bottom of it. So those are the things that I'm going to think about. I've also picked a blue pen, so I'm going to use a blue pen for that because it sounded a bit blue to me. So let's listen and we're going to draw. Well, those are what I felt like I heard. So we had this curly sound, a windy curly sound. We had a bit of a wavy sound, and maybe this felt like that sort of soft shape, like that. Right, let's try another one. I'm going to keep working on the same piece of paper, but you could use another piece of paper if you wanted to. So we're just again going to listen to a tiny little bit of it, have a think about it, and then we'll start drawing. So we know what that's the sound of. That's the sound of rain. And remember we looked at that Lee Ufan painting. I think definitely that felt like an up and down sort of shape. So I'm definitely going to think about that. Also, we could hear the raindrops pattering, couldn't we? Patter, 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 patter onto, I don't know what it was, maybe a pavement or a window. I think I'm going to choose a different colour this time. I think I'm going to choose a black one for a grey, rainy day. Okay, are you ready? Start listening, thinking about how we're going to draw that. So there we go. These were my straight up and down lines, and I was trying to think about these pattery noises. There we go. We got one more, okay? This is one more to listen to. Once again, we're going to listen to it first, then we'll talk about what it might have sounded like. You might be ready to go. If you're ready, you can just keep on drawing. But I'm going to have a listen to this one first before we start. So here's the next one. Right, now that is definitely the sound of the sea, in a storm. So a little bit like that Turner painting that we looked at with those sloshy waves everywhere. So there might be some sloshy wavy shapes, probably some rain, probably some wind as well. So I think, let's listen to it again and see where we're going. I'm going to choose a green one this time. There we go. So there was quite a lot of crashy shapes and also then some wavy shapes for the wind. And then I definitely felt like there were shapes that repeated themselves, that came over and over again. So that has warmed up our ears for thinking about how we can get a shape onto the paper. Now what we're going to do is have a look at the shapes that we've made here. We're going to think about how we can use our wax crayons to make those shapes repeat by making a rubbing. So why don't I show you how that works? And we're going to use all our bits of packaging material. So remember we had, that's just a piece of cardboard from a cardboard box. And that's quite useful because inside this sort of cardboard from a cardboard box, you can find these sort of bumpy lines. If you have a look, you can see that there are sort of bumpy lines. And if you put that underneath your piece of paper, and rub over it, let me show you, you get some really good straight up and down shapes. So if you had straight up and down shapes, that might be a useful thing. I've also got some bubble wrap. Bubble wrap is lots and lots of bobbly shapes. So you might find that bubble wrap, if you did the same with that, popped a bit of bubble wrap under there, if you had some bobbly shapes that you wanted to do, and you rubbed over that, you might find that you get some nice bobbly shapes. Let's have a look. Use a different colour. So you start to see the bobbly shapes of the bubble wrap showing through there. So you might want to use that. Also, you can just cut out from your bit of cereal box or whatever it is. If you cut out some of those shapes, so I had swirly shape, so maybe if I just cut out a swirly shape, let's have a look. And I put my swirly shape under there, then you get the outline of your swirly shape like that. And if you wanted a crashy shape, maybe you could cut out a sharp shape. If you drew some big jagged shapes when we were thinking about the thunder maybe, let's have a look. Maybe a big smashing wave throwing itself into the harbour mouth like that. Maybe that's a good smashy, crashy shape. You might find you've got something like that. So, there are lots of different ways of making these rubbings, and if you have these sorts of shapes in your drawing, let's have a think about how we could make some of these into rubbings and put them out onto our soundscape. So there's some ideas. What we're going to do next is have a think. Remember how we talked about how some artists were using their imaginations and their memories. So what we're going to do is use our imaginations and our memories. If you want to, you can go back and listen to those sounds again. You can just rewind the video and listen to them again. Or you could think of a place that you really like and think of what the soundscape of that place is. So I was thinking that a place I really like is when you go for a walk and you stand on top of a hill and you can hear a blowy wind blowing in your ears, and it makes a sort of wobbly noise in your ears. So I was thinking that I might try making the shape of some hills or the shape of some wind. Now this might sound a bit strange to you, to try and make a landscape out of sound. So shall we look at another artist and see how other artists have used this idea of rubbing or of repeating those shapes over and over again to give you an idea of a rhythm of a landscape. So let's look at this first artwork. This is by an artist called Victor Passmore. And this, I really like this one. It really looks to me like he has thought about standing on a hill. And you can see the rolling clouds, which makes me think it was probably a windy day. And you can also see the shape of those ploughed fields. It's got sort of stripes in the fields, so you can see that green bit is the fields. And then of course I think that that's the sea, so I think that's a cliff face. So you can see he's using that idea of repeated shapes, and he actually made these paintings. He made a few paintings like this, where he was just making those shapes, those swirly shapes, and putting them together and seeing what they looked like. So putting lots of swirly shapes together started to suggest the idea of clouds or wind or landscape to him. And then he created an artwork from those. So we can think about that, repeating our shapes over and over again so that they make a finished piece of work. Let's look at another artist who's used the idea of rubbing. This is actually a print. This is by Prunella Clough. It's actually a print, but she was looking at making rubbings at the time. So you don't have to make a landscape if you don't want to make a landscape. If your soundscape feels to you more like a pattern, then you could do that. So maybe you're thinking of what it sounds like when you're in the playground at school, or what it sounds like when you sit by the window in your bedroom. And maybe those sounds to you don't look like a landscape. Maybe they feel like a pattern. So you could take some shapes, make some interesting shapes, and then use your crayons to rub over the top and put all those shapes together until they make a pattern. So that's a few different ways that you could think about this. I am going to make a landscape because I like the idea of thinking about a place and thinking what it sounds like when you're in that place. So now we'll make along. Remember, you go at your own speed. I'm going to do it at my own speed. And you can pause, you can take inspiration from what I'm doing, you can rewind and look back at what we've done and listen to those sounds again. Or you could go and find a sound of your own if you like, or you could turn the volume down on this and listen to the sounds that you can hear already. So let's get started. I'm going to think about making a shape, maybe for some hills, and I'm going to make it with that up and down on the paper so that we can think about that Victor Passmore. This looks like a good shape for me. So I'm going to cut a hill shape into the top of it. Remember, you can always draw your shapes out first. I just like cutting straight into it. I'm going to slide that behind my paper. And I'm going to use a few different colours. So I'm going to start with a green. Find the edge of it there. So there's a rolling hill. Remember, I was thinking about being on the top of it and with some blowy shapes. So here's my rolling hill. Maybe I'll think about those blowy shapes. Me standing on the top of that hill with my blowy shapes. Let's think about how we could make that shape. I'm going to cut it out of some of this, I think. So maybe I'll draw this one out. Maybe it would be nice to have a curly shape. Like that, a big swirly curl. So I'm going to cut out a big thinking about that Victor Passmore one that we talked about. And maybe that might feel like a swirly wind. Maybe it was a thundery day, so maybe we might put some of that thundery shape or our thundery rain in. There we go, here's my swirly wind. Let's use a blue. And the great thing about rubbings, here's one swirly shape coming in. The great thing about rubbings is that then I don't need to draw that shape again. I can just put another one in. I'm going to use a different colour, a purplish colour. And another one, swirling right in. So there's our swirly shapes. Maybe I might think about the sea now. Think about our swirling sea. Maybe that's where we're going to have our crashy shapes. So remember we made that nice crashy shape here. Perhaps I might use that one. If you made a jagged shape, you might want to use that. The crashing sea. It's going to crash up against this hill like a wave. So there's our smashy shapes, smashing and crashing. We might want some swirly sea, some big waves coming in. So I'm going to get another piece of cardboard and we're going to cut some swirly waves. Let's think about the shape we've got here. Some swirly waves. I'm going to draw those ones out. So I'm thinking about the shapes that I did in my drawing. I'm thinking about the sounds that I heard. Thinking about what it feels like to be out on a windy walk. There we go. Slide them in. What colour shall we do there? Some big waves coming in. And then I'm going to repeat that shape, because remember when we were listening to the sounds, we felt like those were definitely coming in. And then finally, I'm going to have a think about that straight up and down shape that we had, this straight up and down shape here. And I'm going to draw some big rain coming out. So here we go. I'm going to use the black. And then I'm just going to finish off here, putting in a few more shapes for our, I've got that curly shape again. I'm just going to put some of those curly shapes in here for our fields and hills. So I think that's where I'm going to leave mine. We've got swirly shapes here from the wind. We've got straight up and down shapes from the rain. We've got some ideas of what it's like to be on hills. We have to walk up and down. We've got some of those crashy shapes from the waves, some sloshy shapes and some crashy shapes. I'd love to see what you made. I expect yours is quite different. So just remember that you can always send these in. You can submit them to the Tate Kids gallery. And if you're grown-ups on social media, you can also share them on social media using the hashtag Tate Kids. And then we can all see what different sorts of soundscapes we've heard and managed to put down on our paper.